In the last video, we talked about why $20,000 is the mathematical tipping point for wealth. But there's a problem I didn't mention. Getting to $5,000 often feels worse than having $0. You wake up at 3 in the morning with that familiar knot in your stomach. Not because of something you ate or some nightmare you can't remember. You wake up because your brain decided this was the perfect time to remind you that your emergency fund sits at exactly $5,200, and somehow that feels both impressive and completely terrifying at the same time. You've done everything the financial gurus told you to do. You cut back on the lattes, canceled the streaming services you barely watched, and scraped together what most people would consider a respectable emergency fund. You should feel proud. You should feel secure. Instead, you're lying there at 3 in the morning calculating whether $5,200 could handle your car breaking down, your laptop dying, and your cat needing emergency surgery all in the same month. The math doesn't add up, and your brain won't let you forget it. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about why our relationship with money is so fundamentally broken that having more of it can somehow make us feel worse. If you're someone who has saved what you thought was a decent emergency fund only to discover that it feels like financial quicksand, or if you've ever wondered why hitting certain savings milestones doesn't bring the peace of mind you expected, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Because today we're diving into one of the most counterintuitive phenomena in personal finance. We're talking about the emergency fund paradox, where having $5,000 saved can actually increase your anxiety, and why crossing the $20,000 threshold doesn't just change your bank balance. It rewires your entire relationship with risk, decision-making, and what it actually means to feel financially secure. Here's what nobody tells you about emergency funds. They're not really about emergencies. They're about something much more fundamental and much more powerful. They're about the quality of decisions you make when you're not panicked, stressed, or operating from a place of scarcity. But before we get there, we need to understand why the human brain treats financial security like a video game with invisible level thresholds that make absolutely no mathematical sense. Let's start with the brutal truth about $5,000. While the median American actually has less than $1,000 in savings, $5,000 is the first major milestone most people aim for. It's what most financial advisors would call a solid start. It's definitely better than the nearly 40% of Americans who can't cover a $400 emergency with cash. But here's the psychological trap that $5,000 creates. It's significant enough that you feel like you should be secure, but insufficient enough that you know you're not. You're stuck in what researchers call the anxiety plateau, where you've achieved something meaningful, but your brain refuses to let you enjoy it. Think about the last time you had $5,000 sitting in your emergency fund. Your washing machine starts making that grinding noise that definitely means expensive repair bills are coming. Your brain doesn't think, great, I have an emergency fund for exactly this situation. Instead, it thinks, if this washing machine repair costs $800 and then my car needs new tires next month and then literally anything else goes wrong, I'm completely screwed. So the $5,000 doesn't feel like protection, it feels like a countdown timer. This happens because of something called loss aversion. Psychologically, we feel losses twice as intensely as we feel equivalent gains. When you have $5,000 saved, your brain becomes hyper-vigilant about all the ways that money could disappear. You're not thinking about the security it provides, you're obsessing over every potential threat to that security. It's like having a small campfire in a windstorm. Sure, you have light and warmth, but you're constantly worried about the next gust that could blow it out. The mathematics of $5,000 emergency funds look reasonable on paper. The average cost of common repairs falls well within this range. A typical appliance repair runs between $200 and $400. Most car repairs average $800. Even a minor medical emergency might only cost a few $100s. So mathematically, $5,000 should handle the majority of financial surprises you'll encounter. But Here's where human psychology and mathematical logic part ways completely. Your brain doesn't think in averages, it thinks in catastrophes. When you have $5,000 saved, you don't feel prepared for average emergencies. You feel exposed to the worst case scenarios. What if your car needs a new transmission? That's $3,000 to $5,000 right there. What if your air conditioning unit dies in the middle of summer? Another $3,000 to $6,000. What if you need emergency dental work? Easily $2,000 to $4,000. Suddenly, your $5,000 emergency fund feels like pocket change in a world of expensive problems. But the real psychological damage happens when these scenarios start stacking. Your brain doesn't just worry about one emergency at a time, it worries about emergency clusters. The car repair that happens the same month as the medical bill that coincides with your laptop dying. This is where $5,000 goes from feeling inadequate to feeling almost insulting. You've worked hard to save this money, and your reward is lying awake at night doing disaster mathematics. Here's where it gets really interesting. Research from Vanguard shows that people with at least $2,000 in emergency savings report financial well-being that's 21% higher than those with no emergency savings at all. But the same research reveals that this psychological benefit plateaus quickly. Having $3,000 doesn't feel dramatically better than having $2,000. Having $4,000 doesn't feel much better than having $3,000. And having $5,000 can actually create more anxiety than having $2,000 because the stakes feel higher. This is what I call the false summit effect. You've climbed high enough to see how much further you still have to go. And the view is terrifying. When you had $1,000 saved, you knew you were vulnerable, but you also knew you were just getting started. When you have $5,000 saved, you feel like you should have arrived somewhere, but you're still fundamentally insecure. You're stuck in the psychological no man's land between broke and secure. The $5,000 threshold also creates what behavioral economists call cognitive dissonance. You know intellectually that you have more financial security than most people. The data tells you that you're doing better than average, but emotionally, you feel just as vulnerable as you did when you had nothing saved. This disconnect between what you think you should feel and what you actually feel creates its own form of financial stress. It gets worse when you start comparing your situation to the emergencies happening around you. Your coworker gets hit with an $8,000 medical bill. Your neighbor needs a new roof after a storm, and insurance only covers half. Your friend's car gets totaled and they're underwater on their loan. Suddenly, your $5,000 doesn't just feel inadequate, it feels naive, like bringing a pocket knife to a financial gunfight. The neuroscience behind this makes perfect sense. When your emergency fund feels insufficient, your brain activates the amygdala, the fear center that's designed to keep you alive in dangerous situations. This triggers a state of chronic low-level anxiety that affects your sleep, your decision-making, and your overall well-being. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thinking and long-term planning, gets hijacked by constant worry about financial threats. This is why people with $5,000 emergency funds often make worse financial decisions than people with either much less or much more saved. They're operating from a place of scarcity disguised as security. They second-guess investments because they're worried about needing that money for emergencies. They avoid necessary spending on preventative maintenance because they're trying to preserve their buffer. They turn down opportunities that might require short-term financial risk because their emergency fund feels too precious to potentially compromise. The irony becomes even more twisted when you consider that having $5,000 saved often makes you more conservative with money, not less. You start hoarding that emergency fund like it's made of plutonium. You won't touch it for anything that isn't a certified, life-threatening, no other options emergency. Meanwhile, smaller expenses that could prevent bigger emergencies get ignored because you're protecting your precious buffer. Your car starts making a weird noise. A smart person with unlimited money would get it checked immediately. A broke person would ignore it because they have no choice. But you, with your $5,000 emergency fund, find yourself in this bizarre middle ground where you're too worried about depleting your fund to spend $150 on preventative maintenance. So you wait and pray. And 3 months later, that weird noise turns into a $3,000 transmission replacement that could have been prevented with a $150 tune-up. This is the emergency fund paradox in action. Having money makes you so afraid of not having money that you make decisions that practically guarantee you'll have less money. It's like being so worried about using your parachute that you forget to pull the ripcord. Now, let's talk about what happens when you cross the magical threshold into $20,000 territory. And I do mean magical because the psychological shift that occurs around this number defies mathematical logic. It's not that $20,000 is twice as good as $10,000. It's that $20,000 represents an entirely different category of financial security that changes how your brain processes risk, opportunity, and decision making. At $20,000, something remarkable happens in your neural pathways. Your amygdala stops firing constantly. Your prefrontal cortex regains control. You stop operating from a place of scarcity and start operating from what psychologists call a secure base. This isn't just feel-good psychology. This is measurable neuroscience with real-world financial consequences. Here's what $20,000 actually buys you, and it's not what you think. It doesn't buy you protection from emergencies. $20,000 can disappear just as fast as $5,000 if you hit a real catastrophe. What $20,000 buys you is protection from bad decisions. It buys you the cognitive space to think clearly when problems arise, instead of panic solving your way into bigger problems. Consider the difference in how you approach the same emergency with $5,000 versus $20,000 saved. Your laptop dies and you need a computer for work. With $5,000 in emergency savings, this feels like a crisis. You start researching the absolute cheapest laptop that might possibly meet your needs. You spend hours comparing prices, reading reviews, agonizing over whether to spend $400 or $600. You end up buying something barely adequate that you'll probably need to replace in 2 years. With $20,000 in emergency savings, the same laptop death feels like an inconvenience. You buy a quality machine that will last 5 years and increase your productivity. You don't waste emotional energy on the decision. You solve the problem efficiently and move on with your life. The emergency fund didn't prevent the emergency, but it prevented the emergency from derailing your judgment. This principle scales up to every area of your financial life. People with substantial emergency funds don't just have more money, they have better insurance deductibles because they can afford higher out-of-pocket costs. They negotiate harder at work because they have walking away money. They make better investment decisions because they're not constantly worried about needing to liquidate assets for emergencies. The $20,000 threshold also unlocks what I call compound confidence. It's not just that you feel more secure. It's that your increased security enables behaviors that make you even more secure. You sleep better, which improves your work performance, which leads to better career prospects, which increases your earning potential. You stress less about money, which improves your relationships, which provides emotional support that reduces other life costs. But here's the part that really bends your mind. Research shows that the psychological benefits of emergency funds aren't proportional to their size. Going from $0 to $2,000 provides massive psychological relief. Going from $2,000 to $5,000 provides moderate additional comfort. But going from $15,000 to $20,000 provides disproportionate psychological benefits because you're crossing into an entirely different mental category. It's like the difference between being able to tread water and being able to swim to shore. Both keep you from drowning, but only one gives you the confidence to venture into deeper waters. At $20,000, you're not just surviving potential emergencies. You're thriving because the fear of potential emergencies no longer controls your decision-making process. The most successful people I know don't think about emergency funds as protection from catastrophes. They think about them as cognitive performance enhancers. Having substantial cash reserves doesn't just prevent financial disasters, it prevents the mental disasters that come from making important decisions while stressed, scared, and operating from scarcity. This is why the traditional advice to save 3 to 6 months of expenses misses the psychological component entirely. The math might say that $8,000 covers 3 months of expenses for your household, but if $8,000 doesn't get you to the psychological threshold where you stop living in constant fear of financial vulnerability, you haven't achieved the real goal of an emergency fund. The goal was never just to cover emergencies. The goal was to create enough buffer that emergencies don't transform you into a worse version of yourself. When you're financially vulnerable, every problem becomes existential. When you have genuine emergency fund security, problems become puzzles to solve rather than threats to your survival. This explains why people often report that their first $20,000 saved was harder than their first $100,000 invested. It's not because saving is harder than investing. It's because that first $20,000 is doing psychological work that money will never do again. It's buying you out of scarcity mindset and into abundance mindset. Every dollar after that is just math. Understanding this changes how you think about building your emergency fund. You're not just accumulating money, you're purchasing decision-making quality. You're buying the cognitive space to think clearly during stressful situations. You're investing in your future self's ability to respond to challenges from a position of strength rather than weakness. The emergency fund paradox reveals something profound about human psychology and money. We think we want financial security, but what we really want is the mental freedom that comes from not having to think about financial security. We want to reach the point where money problems become logistics problems instead of identity crises. But the plot twist nobody talks about is that once you understand this psychological machinery, you can actually hack it. You don't need to stumble blindly through the emergency fund journey like most people do, slowly accumulating money while wondering why you still feel financially naked. You can be strategic about crossing these psychological thresholds. The first hack is understanding that your emergency fund isn't competing with your other financial goals. It's enabling them. Most people think they need to choose between building an emergency fund and investing for retirement, paying off debt, or saving for a house. This is backwards thinking. Your emergency fund is what makes all your other financial decisions possible without panic. When you don't have that buffer, every financial choice becomes a potential disaster. Should you put an extra $500 toward your student loans this month? Well, what if your car breaks down? Should you contribute more to your retirement account? But what if you need that money for emergencies? Without adequate reserves, you're constantly hedging your bets and making suboptimal decisions across your entire financial life. This is why financial advisors who tell you to pay off debt before building your emergency fund are technically correct, but psychologically wrong. Sure, mathematically, it makes sense to pay off credit card debt at 18% interest before saving money that earns 2% in a savings account. But humans don't operate on pure mathematics. They operate on fear, uncertainty, and the need for control. A person trying to pay off debt without an emergency fund is like someone trying to lose weight while starving. The scarcity creates such intense psychological pressure that they end up making worse decisions than if they had just maintained some buffer. They skip the debt payment to save for emergencies. They tap the emergency fund to make debt payments. They create a psychological tug of war that sabotages both goals. The smarter approach is to build your buffer first, even if it's not mathematically optimal. Get to that $20,000 threshold where your brain can think clearly, then attack your debt with the full force of someone who isn't constantly worried about financial survival. You'll pay it off faster because you'll be more consistent, more focused, and less likely to make panic decisions that derail your progress. The second hack is recognizing that emergency fund building isn't about discipline, it's about architecture. Most people try to build their emergency fund through willpower, cutting expenses, and hoping they'll have money left over at the end of the month. This approach works about as well as trying to lose weight by relying on willpower not to eat cookies. Instead, you need to architect your emergency fund building into your financial system. Automate transfers so the money disappears before you can spend it. Use high-yield savings accounts in different banks so accessing the money requires intentional steps. Create friction between you and your emergency fund so you can't accidentally spend it on things that feel urgent but aren't actually emergencies. The most effective emergency fund builders treat saving like a bill. They don't save what's left over, they save first and spend what's left over. This isn't just good financial advice, it's psychological protection. When saving is automatic, you don't have to make the decision to save every month. You just have to make the decision once to set up the system. But here's where most people mess this up. They set up the automation and then constantly override it. Their car needs new tires, so they skip the automatic transfer. Their friend's wedding is next month, so they redirect the emergency fund contribution to their vacation fund. They treat their automated savings like a suggestion rather than a commitment. The people who successfully build substantial emergency funds understand that automation only works if you actually let it work. They create enough margin in their budget that they can handle normal fluctuations without touching their emergency fund contributions. They accept that some months will be tighter than others, but they never sacrifice long-term security for short-term convenience. The third hack is the most counterintuitive one. You need to spend your emergency fund to build your emergency fund. This sounds completely backwards, but it's actually the key to understanding what money is really for. Money isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be used strategically to improve your life and increase your future earning potential. Think about it this way. You have $5,000 saved and your laptop starts glitching. You could buy a cheap replacement for $400 and preserve most of your emergency fund. Or you could spend $1,500 on a quality laptop that will last 5 years and significantly improve your productivity. Most people with inadequate emergency funds choose the cheap option because they're terrified of depleting their buffer. The brutal truth is that emergency funds aren't about emergencies at all. They're about buying yourself the luxury of thinking clearly when everything goes sideways. That $20,000 threshold isn't just a number. It's your brain's price tag for peace of mind. So stop treating your emergency fund like a participation trophy and start treating it like the cognitive performance enhancer it actually is. Your future self will thank you when problems feel like puzzles instead of panic attacks.